The stories. Why the paramedic returned to that turnout. In early March of 2017, a state trooper found a decommissioned ambulance parked just off a mountain turnout east of Ridge County. The vehicle was empty, its back doors wide open, with one boot and a stethoscope left on the asphalt. It was later confirmed the items belonged to a paramedic named Mark Renner, who had driven that same route almost exactly 1 year earlier. What drew him back to the same turnout became the center of one of the strangest internal reviews in the county's emergency services history. Mark was 39, a quiet man who'd spent nearly 2 decades in the field. He'd seen wrecks, fires, and overdoses, the kind of scenes that hollowed out most people within a few years, but he stayed steady. Colleagues said he was professional, unshakable. The only story that ever seemed to trouble him was an accident from late February of 2016. A head-on collision on Route 92 involving a young couple and their infant daughter. The child had survived for 23 minutes in his care before the helicopter arrived, but the parents hadn't made it. Mark never forgot her crying. That sound stayed with him long after the shift ended. According to dispatch logs, Mark stopped requesting overnight shifts after that incident. He rotated into training duties for a few months, then back to field work once he was cleared by department counseling. Nothing seemed off until that following March, when he quietly signed up for the same overnight route, the same mountain stretch, and never came home. Investigators later reconstructed his movements from station cameras and gas receipts. He'd clocked in at 7:04 p.m., stopped for coffee at a roadside diner around 8:30, and drove north up the highway before pulling into the turnout just after 9:10. The dash cam on his unit, recovered from the ambulance, recorded 19 minutes of footage before cutting out. It showed a still landscape, empty road, light snow, and Mark stepping out of the cab, walking toward the guardrail, then disappearing into the dark. There was no struggle, no second figure, no sound beyond the wind. The first assumption was suicide. But the ground search found no trace. No footprints beyond a few feet from the guardrail, no sign of a fall down the ravine. The terrain was steep but not lethal, and cadaver dogs found nothing. When heavy rains swept through 2 days later, investigators halted the search. The county logged it as a presumed drowning, though the river below was shallow and slow-moving that time of year. Nearly 6 months passed before anything new surfaced. In August, a hiker found a sealed envelope wedged beneath a loose plank at a forest overlook, about 3 miles from the turnout. Inside was a folded piece of paper in a waterproof bag, written in uneven block letters. "I came back because I heard her." The note was signed M.R. and dated the same night Mark vanished. At first, analysts dismissed it as a hoax, maybe something left by someone who'd followed the case in the news. But when the lab examined the paper, they confirmed partial fingerprints matching Mark's employment file. The note's ink also matched a brand of pen issued in ambulance restock kits that year. For a while, speculation spread quietly through the department. Some said Mark had been unstable, still haunted by the loss of the infant. Others insisted he'd been fine. Then an old colleague, a retired dispatcher named Ruth Canning, came forward with something she'd kept an archived radio call from the night of his disappearance. She hadn't turned it in earlier because she thought it was just static bleed from another channel, but she'd kept the recording out of habit. When the file was cleaned and enhanced, it revealed something strange. A faint secondary voice overlaying Mark's transmission. He'd called in a routine report. "Unit 307, clear, returning to station." But beneath his words was another voice, faint and distorted, repeating a single phrase, "Still here." Audio experts couldn't fully isolate the sound. It could have been cross-channel interference, a bleed from another frequency, or an artifact from faulty wiring. Still, that clip reignited interest in the case. When investigators compared the timestamps, they realized the radio call had been made exactly 1 minute before the dashcam cut out. Following the renewed attention, a new team reviewed Mark's digital trail. On his department-issued tablet, recovered from the front seat, the last accessed file wasn't a dispatch log. It was a photo stored in a personal folder labeled Training Refs. The image, according to metadata, had been taken 1 year earlier on the night of the crash. It showed the infant's car seat illuminated by the ambulance's interior light with a small knitted blanket tucked inside. Nothing seemed unusual until they enhanced the reflection on the rear window. A faint outline of Mark turned toward the seat, mouth open as if speaking. The lead investigator, Lieutenant Harris, later told a local paper that what struck him most wasn't the evidence, but the timing. Every major event in Mark's final weeks corresponded with the accident's anniversary, the same dates, the same hours, even the same shift requests. It was as if he'd been tracing the exact pattern of that night. The county eventually filed its final report as undetermined circumstances. The official narrative suggested exhaustion, stress, and possible exposure contributing to disorientation and accidental injury. Yet, off the record, several responders admitted unease. One firefighter recalled hearing a distant sound of crying during the initial search, echoing faintly through the ravine, though no infant was ever found. In 2018, the turnout was repaved and renamed, and most people moved on. But every year, around late February, local radio operators report short bursts of static on the old EMS frequency. They last only seconds and usually coincide with wind gusts off the ridge. Nothing verifiable ever transmits through. Today, a small marker stands at that turnout, a simple white post with no inscription. Truckers still pull over there to check their brakes before the steep descent. Some say if you stop long enough, the silence feels heavier than it should, as if the air itself remembers something unresolved. No one ever proved what happened to Mark Renner. Theories range from a fall to voluntary disappearance, even to mistaken identity. What remains certain is that he returned there by choice. The note, the radio call, the anniversary, all pointed toward a man circling back to a moment he couldn't let go of. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A paramedic haunted by one unfinished call, a turnout carved into the mountainside, and an unanswered question that time refused to bury. The rest is silence, the kind that fills the air between sirens, waiting for someone to break it again. The stories. These archived tapes were a warning at the lake. The county kept a box of old tapes that nobody requested, though people mentioned a lake in half the labels. Each reel carried a handwritten date in faded ink, spanning from 1984 through 2001, then stopping abruptly. Rena Valdez was 34, a county records technician who covered the public window and handled the backroom shelves. She had planned a quick shift, then a quiet drive to her sister's apartment for leftover stew and television. The box of tapes ruined that plan because the new intern stacked it crookedly, and the lid slid open suddenly. One cardboard sleeve read Lake Patrol. Another said Ranger Tower 2. The thickest sleeve said Dispatch Saturdays. A note at the bottom said duplicates for training, reportedly returned after audit, do not discard. The dates matched a period locals still referenced with nervous jokes, which meant details might still identify private people. She logged the box in a generic way, using the Lakeshore District and a wide date range to protect identities. She told herself it would wait until Monday. Then she found herself winding a reel on the library machine. The machine clicked softly, and a voice filled the tiny playback room, thin and metallic. The first tape was a ranger briefing about posted signs and seasonal closures, and nothing seemed strange at first hearing. A man listed wind patterns, then a woman read names for volunteer cleanups, and then someone said maintenance reported missing bolts on the north dock. The voice added that the bolts were not stripped, they were removed carefully without damaging the boards. A second tape included a dispatcher answering calls about diesel sheen near the old boat ramp. According to the label, fishermen reported a smell like hot plastic, and a teenager reported chain rattling under the planks after dark. The dispatcher kept people calm while advising them to stick to lit areas and avoid the roped section. Rena paused the machine and wrote notes in her spiral, keeping each line factual with times and initials. She checked the storage log for incident reports from those dates, and the log showed vague entries about routine patrol and no injuries. It seemed like a cluster of small maintenance problems, which did not explain the careful script on the warning sleeves. She switched reels, and a new voice took over, quieter and closer to the microphone. The label said Saturdays 2. with a date from 1991 in shaky handwriting and a stamped number. The voice mentioned archived calls about chain noises again and added that footprints led down the roped section in soft silt. Someone in the room asked about weather, and the answer was light wind, clear night, no boats scheduled after sunset. The voice then read a memo that asked rangers to log all interactions with a particular vendor near the snack stand. It said, "Do not escalate, document demeanor, and confirm hours against posted permits," using a separate clipboard. Rena recognized the clipboard instruction style, which matched old county risk templates for potential liability tracking. Vendors generated paperwork when things went sideways, especially near open water with kids, which made steady documentation crucial later. Still, the tapes kept circling the same triangle of dock bolts, chain noises, and the roped section. She printed a map from the binder with blank labels, then drew a tidy triangle between the dock, the snack stand, and the ranger tower. The map helped her visualize lines of sight, and she started marking places with little asterisks for maintenance incidents. The roped section sat slightly east, hidden from the snack stand by cottonwoods, which mattered for visibility. Another reel played a clipped exchange where a ranger told dispatch that a gate lock appeared new and unregistered. The ranger added that cones were moved and a laminated warning sign had clean nail holes without rust. The dispatcher asked for photos, and the answer was already taken and copied for the folder labeled permits. The next tape changed tone with a shaky breath before an officer started reading notes into the recorder deliberately. He said witnesses reported a loud splash near midnight, then a truck engine idling on the far turnout. He said tracks showed heavy tread, then lighter footsteps heading back alone, and a partial plate was recorded without certainty. Rena stopped and checked the case index, trying to locate an incident number referencing a midnight splash during that month. The index only showed a maintenance order for replacing stolen chain and a request for more reflective tape. She underlined the lack of a matching incident and added a small arrow to her running list for later verification. On Tuesday morning, she asked her supervisor if she could inventory the box more thoroughly since the reels were fragile. He nodded without interest, telling her to log whatever needed logging and to shove the box behind tax rolls. That gave her private time in the playback room, which she used to build a timeline on fresh paper. She listened to another Saturday tape where a woman from the tower called dispatch about a boat drifting across the boundary. The boat moved lazily, but the line drifted toward the roped section, which was posted as no entry. The woman sounded firm, and she logged the time. Then she asked for a ranger with a bullhorn. A tiny clink echoed on the tape before a second voice said, "Hold on," then added that a chain was loosened again. The tower watched two shapes bending by the boundary floats, and the dispatcher repeated the request for immediate response. Sirens filtered faintly through the recorder. Then the tape ended with an abrupt click that did not feel accidental. Rena checked the log again and found only a note about routine lake closure with citation for boundary violation. She highlighted the citation number and scribbled a request to pull the paper copy from the offsite cabinet. If the citation sheet had officer notes, she might find names replaced with initials and a vendor detail. In the afternoon, the intern returned with coffee, and Rena asked if he knew the lake from hiking around. He said his cousins called it the turnaround because teens use the far turnout to swap drivers late at night. He said people heard the chain in the wind and joked that it meant a shift change for the lake. She asked about the vendor by the snack stand, and he shrugged, saying an older guy sold bait from a cooler. He added that the man kept to himself and that the stand closed after 2003 when bathrooms needed repair. Rena thanked him, then went back to the machine, because one more reel had Ranger Tower 2 in heavy ink. The reel opened with playful teasing about coffee. Then a woman said the boundary floats were drifting again toward the shallow shelf. She made a note that the vendor stayed late, counting cash, and that 3 pickup trucks idled by the turnout. She said wind from the ridge pushed small waves against the dock posts, and the sound carried. Then came a gentle thud, and the woman said quietly that bolt heads were missing again on the north ladder. She asked anyone nearby to bring a camera and mentioned small shavings near the posts, like metal caught and ground shiny. She said it looked new, not weathered, and suggested logging it as tampering after checking permits. Rena wrote ladder bolt heads missing and circled the phrase carefully then drew a line to the earlier chain note. She felt the outline of something organized, not merely bad luck, and the tapes added a pattern of late Saturdays. She felt a pinch of frustration because the official paper trail looked deliberately harmless compared to the recordings. She filed a request to review tower logs that year, and the clerk gave her a battered binder with loose pages. The tower logs used pencil, and the Saturday pages looked smudged, but several entries repeated a vendor name pattern. The pattern matched the earlier instruction to log demeanor and hours, which meant quiet escalation without confrontation. An evening tape from 2001 began with static. Then the dispatcher said the tower line would record summaries every hour. The tower voice read weather, then listed vehicles, then paused at a truck with a partially obscured plate covered by dust. The tower added that the truck bed held a heavy chain coiled flat and the ends taped tight. Rena felt the air in the room go thin. Though she knew she was just listening to old caution collected for audits, the tower voice kept going, steady and calm, calling out 2 sets of footsteps and 1 pair returning alone toward the turnout. Then the tower said the vendor appeared nervous, closing early and locking a cooler with a new padlock. Another reel documented a ranger walking the roped section at dawn, taking photos of raw scrapes on chain links. The ranger said the scrapes were bright, not dull, and the boundary floats had new gouges near the welded rings. He guessed someone had dragged the chain to the shelf, making deep channels beside the ladder posts. She studied the map again, measuring distances with the edge of a note card and aligning the triangle to the shoreline. The shelf sat where the cold current ran channel to channel, sucking down loose gear and stunned fish every spring. If someone knew that flow, they could use it to hide things quickly, maybe even move something heavy without splashing. The county maintained a box of anonymous tips from that period, and Rena requested the file through the clerk quietly. The tips mentioned fights in the turnout, and a truck with fresh dents, and late-night cash counting by the stand. One tip described a crying woman near the chain in 1991, then wrote, "He told her to get in now." Rena breathed slowly and kept her notes clinical, because she was not a detective and the tapes were not a case file. She wrote potential domestic dispute near boundary, then wrote check for missing persons in overlapping county dates. She cross-referenced the years against a public list of unresolved reports, without printing names or addresses. Within that public list, several families had posted memorial pages that mentioned the lake vaguely without pinning a location. The dates brushed the Saturday span, and at least one message thanked volunteers who had searched old drainage channels. Rena did not draw conclusions, but she felt the box had been kept near the window for a reason. The thickest reel contained a training segment that sounded like a quiet warning wrapped as procedure. A supervisor read instructions for dock inspections, then emphasized that bolts should be numbered and painted once installed. He said repeated substitutions by outside contractors had caused confusion, then urged rangers to photograph every ladder each week. He read slowly, reminding staff to check chain markings and to log any bright scrapes within 24 hours. He asked that vendor interactions stay cordial but detailed, and that cash counts should match posted hour sheets precisely. He repeated that night closures had reasons, and that the roped section protected a shelf known for unpredictable suction. The tape ended with a short statement that felt heavier than a standard sign-off, even to someone outside enforcement work. The supervisor said the lake keeps receipts, and he called tape steel a kind of ledger if you knew how to read. He then asked that all summaries be placed in the Saturday binder, followed by a written note in the permit folder. Rena returned the reels to their sleeves, then updated the entry in the inventory system with a quiet summary. She wrote that the contents included dispatch summaries, tower logs, and training instructions, and that these might interest risk management. She flagged the box for restricted copying and added a line suggesting improved storage due to evidentiary value. That night, she drove to the lake and parked by the official overlook, staying within the open hours like a normal visitor. The water looked glossy and harmless, and a steady breeze shoved new leaves across the shore in rattling waves. Families packed up coolers, while a ranger checked the rope line and reset a slack float with a practice tug. She walked the path between the tower and the snack stand, then down to the dock where the ladder bolts gleamed. They were painted red, and small numbers were stamped into the heads, which suggested a new practice after the tapes. A sign near the rope read "No entry, shelf unstable," and the letters were bold without clutter. A man in a lake crew shirt saw her taking photos and asked if she needed anything, and she said just admiring. He nodded and said they had redone the hardware, then added that the chain had been upgraded to a heavier gauge. He pointed out a new anchor a few yards deeper where the current used to pull and said it cost plenty. She asked if the improvements followed a particular incident, and he smiled without offering details, then looked toward the tower. He said the lake gets busier every year, and they prefer keeping rules friendly and simple to help everyone. He wished her a good evening and kept walking, tapping each cleat along the dock with a small hammer. At her desk the next morning, she wrote one final paragraph for the internal memo, careful with every single word. She explained that the tapes documented a pattern of weekend tampering around a hazardous shelf with persistent chain disturbances. She wrote that witnesses described idling trucks and partial plates, and that tower logs flagged a vendor for careful tracking. She recommended digitizing the reels, then filing them with risk management as potential warnings that improved current safety practices. She attached her timeline and map using initials and generic labels to avoid identifying anyone who might still live nearby. She kept her tone neutral because the point was preservation, not drama, and the tapes already carried weight. Before sealing the memo, she added a small line that explained how the tapes worked like a quiet lighthouse. They glowed in the dark of back rooms, keeping watch over a place that looked relaxed but demanded attention. They did not accuse anyone directly, but they pointed toward the triangle where the water kept its swift accounting. She delivered the memo to her supervisor, who skimmed it, then set it aside for the weekly folder without comment. He asked if the reels were labeled securely, and she said yes, and he nodded and said good, thank you. The box returned to the shelf, but the entry now carried a bright strip indicating restricted handling under department guidance. A week later, Risk Management requested digital transfers, citing an internal review of seasonal safety procedures for public areas. They noted that the dock hardware had improved and that the chain layout matched new engineering reports after recent surveys. They asked for any additional recordings from surrounding years to complete their context for training material. Rena stayed out of that conversation because her role stopped at preservation, though she felt a calm sense of completion. The Saturday binder had finally spoken in full sentences, and everything pointed toward the same quiet conclusion. The tapes were a warning written in small sounds that added up to a clear map of careful harm. When she finally visited her sister that weekend, the stew tasted warm, and the apartment felt crowded with plants. She described none of the lake details, only saying she liked hearing old voices explain rules that still mattered today. Her sister laughed and said she had always loved rule followers because they were the ones who kept doors from sticking. In the months that followed, the dock signs stayed bright, the chains stayed tight, and the roped section kept its distance. Families watched sunsets without wandering across the floats, while rangers checked the ladder bolts and stamped numbers. A new plaque near the overlook said thank you to volunteers for years of safe seasons without naming anyone specifically. People told stories anyway, because lakes attract stories, and most were harmless and not entirely accurate. Rena preferred the tapes because they never chased drama, and they always returned to measured facts. They cared about footprints on silt and bright scrapes on metal and the way a current can tell time. If someone asked her privately why a box of tapes mattered, she offered a simple answer without personal detail. The lake taught the staff to listen for small patterns, and the tapes taught the staff to write them down. Warnings are not always loud, and sometimes they arrive as quiet instructions that keep strangers safe. She thought of the supervisor who said the lake keeps receipts, and she believed him without needing a name or headline. The water gave back bolts and shavings and slack rope, and the staff learned to read that ledger patiently. In that way, the old Saturday voices kept working, guiding hands without demanding attention or applause. By the next summer, the tower logged more visitors and fewer citations, and the vendor stand sold cold drinks, not bait. The chain still hummed on windy nights, but people heard it as a plain boundary, not a rumor. The tapes stayed in climate storage, digitized and labeled, a warning preserved as training rather than tragedy. When the county finally archived the memo with the transfer receipts, Rena slid a copy into her personal binder. She liked the neatness of an ending that did not demand a dramatic reveal, only patient steps that matched evidence. The lake did not need a ghost, it needed attention, and those tapes had asked for it many years ago. She drove by the overlook after work one evening, watching the sun burn down into a clean line on the water. A ranger tapped the cleats again, just like before, and the chain lay tight and bright across the current. The triangle she drew on paper felt like a familiar shape in her mind, precise and ordinary, and finally understood. The snowplow incident on Dalton Highway. In early winter of 2019, a road crew based near Coldfoot reported a missing operator after an overnight maintenance run north. Drivers said the weather thinned for an hour near Otagon Pass, then returned with sharp spindrift across the grade. The report reached a small dispatch room where radio traffic had stayed busy with chain controls and stalled rigs. The first message named a man who left mile marker notes, then failed to clear his scheduled checkpoint on the north slope. The operator was Mark Reyes, 44, a contract plow driver from Fairbanks assigned to the Slope District for the season. He ran a late shift that began after dusk with fuel topped and a spare V-belt strapped under the seat. His purpose was straightforward since the company had a fixed route that required timed passes across exposed sections. Witnesses remembered his voice on the radio sounding even, with short replies that kept to mile numbers and cold readings. Dispatch logs from that night list a start north of Coldfoot at 1900 hours, with guidance to hold before Otagon if winds rose. Archived notes in the district binder describe patch ice near the summit and reports of light snow sliding off the cut banks. A tanker convoy reportedly waited near Dietrich River since heavy gusts had pushed 2 tractor-trailers into the berm earlier. The shift sheet shows Dana Willis, 39, a dispatcher based in Fairbanks, who stayed on the channel while supervisors rotated. State records show Reyes had 12 winters on heavy equipment, with no citations and a completed safety course during 2011. He'd worked pipeline access roads, he'd pulled a grader for a private quarry, and he'd logged clear plow counts on previous runs. His intent that night was to punch through 3 choke points, then meet a mechanic near Galbraith Lake for a salt spreader swap. The mechanic was Evan Tuttle, 52. A seasonal hire whose task was to transfer gear and check hydraulic temperatures before midnight. Some locals claimed a whiteout dropped into the pass fast enough to erase taillights and mute engine sound, yet truckers never agreed. One driver said strobing snow gave the illusion of hills moving sideways across the road while the wheels stayed straight. Another said the wind was loud, but gaps kept opening, and distant beacons appeared steady along the grade for several minutes. Investigators never confirmed a single window of clear weather, since recordings captured only static bursts and clipped phrases around the summit. At 2100, Reyes checked in at a pullout south of the pass, with coolant temperature stable and front blade pressure within range. He mentioned one brief shudder through the chassis that felt like a rut. Then silence followed until a short click cut the frequency. Willis radioed back twice with location requests and received nothing, then pinged a nearby rig to scan the shoulder with high beams. The rig driver said he saw drifting grooves that could have been old tracks since fresh snow filled them within seconds. A tracker unit on the plow reportedly sent 3 location bursts clustered near a curve marked by a steep drop to the creek. Technicians said the pings bounced off a repeater and came through delayed, so the timing stamps failed to match the voice log. Search teams moved in after midnight from both sides, and a grader led with chains laced tight across 2 tires. Snow fell in sheets that flattened depth and made shallow cuts look like pits, which slowed the lead truck to walking speed. They reached the curve at first light and found a blade mark that ended clean beside a low drift with no metal exposed. A second pass scraped the shoulder and revealed a hard ridge with chunks of ice wedged above a narrow gouge that fell away. Rope teams moved over the edge and found short slide debris on a bench, then a broken marker flag snagged against brush. No frame parts surfaced during those hours, and the creek ran under plates of ice that shifted with a faint grinding sound. County file from 2009 includes a similar incident where a grader vanished for 2 days before surfacing downstream near a bend. That case resolved when thaw lowered the berm and exposed a mirror that caught sun from a brief break in cloud. The comparison circulated among crew members who kept working the shoulder, yet the terrain here was different with steeper runoff cuts. Records conflict on how quickly the water can rise under drifted ice after strong wind, and the team deferred to the field lead. By late morning, a fuel tender from Deadhorse reached the site and set up heaters near a staging point above the drop. Tuttle arrived from the north with tools and asked for the last radio phrase, then checked the hydraulic lines of a parked plow. He noted a tendency for the quick couplers to chatter during crosswind, which could sound like harsh rattle over the cab floor. Mechanics later wrote that cab noise might mask a failing sensor, since cold snap could trigger alarms that barely breached the static. Aerial support from a contractor circled the pass after wind eased, and the observer described a faint brown scar cutting the slope. The scar blended with ripples left by earlier slides, and a few dark smudges along the line looked like willows pressed flat. Photographs show no bright paint or reflective decal, though one frame catches a straight groove pointing toward a tight creek bend. Investigators never confirmed those features as relevant, since snow squalls smeared edges between frames and made distances hard to judge. Afternoon brought a partial clearing that revealed a fan of ice shards downstream, and a thin sheen of coolant floated in a pool. Samples were jarred for testing, and the chain crew shifted downhill with bars to pry plates loose where the creek narrowed. A snapped radio whip surfaced near a root ball and looked fresh, but the base had no distinct paint and the mount was missing. Some locals claimed scavengers grabbed parts fast after wind events, although crews said nothing moves under that much drifted ice. Willis compiled a timeline that night using dispatch logs and audio clips, then flagged minutes where Reyes last sounded clear and calm. She included notes on tanker releases and 2 reports about a stopped reefer whose engine coughs overlapped the plow check-in. The final packet lists contacts with the State Patrol and a maintenance foreman who drove south to relieve the tired search crew. That foreman added tire print photos that seem to double along the shoulder, which can occur when chains stamp over their own path. During the second day, a Parkerized tow hook appeared in a melt pocket with scratches no wider than a thumbnail along the curve. The hook matched a model used on the plow fleet, yet maintenance inventory showed 6 variations that had circulated for years. Without a serial, technicians wrote a reserved note that placed the hook in a probable category rather than as verified evidence. Some locals claimed the hook drifted from higher on the slope, while others said the creek likely dragged it after a brief surge. On the third day, crews uncovered a ladder rack buried in compact snow beside a narrow stand of willows near the creek. The rack fit, the plow make, and bolt patterns lined up within tolerances, which moved the case toward a likely location. A downstream net caught a small panel stamped with 2 digits that matched the fleet series, though corrosion blurred the final number. Investigators never confirmed whether the panel came from Reyes's machine, and state records marked the find as inconclusive with an asterisk. A trucker who runs that road each week provided a sworn statement that places a bright headlight west of the proper lane. He said the beam cut across a hump of snow and flashed once, then vanished as wind shifted, which he logged against his odometer. Another driver produced a dash recording where only hiss and faint pops can be heard during that minute near the summit pullout. Records conflict on whether either account fits the minute Reyes went quiet, since clock drift and reception gaps complicate the match. A 4th-day probe found the plow nose buried in a kink where the creek dives under a bank and resurfaces in a small pool. Divers worked under ice with lines and spotted a cab corner wedged against a boulder, then a shattered mirror floating free. The recovery took hours as the weather dropped again, and the team cut a trench to guide the frame toward a winch. When the cab cleared, the seatbelt latch showed marks from impact, and the ignition key sat half-turned with the radio switch on. The medical report is brief and cites blunt force trauma with a probable sequence that begins with a sudden drop along the hidden bank. It notes no sign of alcohol and a normal panel, plus bruising that aligns with a violent jolt as the frame struck rock. Investigators never confirmed whether the initial slide began from crosswind push or a shelf collapse that undercut the drift from below. The final line lists cause as accident during storm response, with contributing factors that include limited visibility and shifting ice. In the months after, crews added poles near the curve and new markers above the creek, and radio checks increased before the summit. The company revised night runs and paired plows for that section, while dispatch set tighter windows for convoys during early gust fronts. Some locals claimed the changes came too late and that old warnings about the creek shelf sat ignored in a forgotten drawer. Archived notes show earlier mentions of undercut edges that never reached policy, though supervisors say budget cycles delayed permanent fixes. The Dalton Highway kept running through that winter and the next, and the pass remained a place where visibility turns to noise. State records preserve the photographs and the hook, and the rack sits tagged in a bin that lists the mile number. Drivers still slow near the curve and watch the creek where drifted plates hold for a week, then crack without warning. The file closes with a sentence that keeps to the facts and a road sign that leans slightly north when the wind rises. The stories. This night guard filed a missing hours report. The file started as something routine, a timestamp discrepancy in a small-town security log. A night guard at a regional warehouse filed a missing hours report, claiming his time card didn't match the hours he'd actually worked. The report was short, oddly calm, and dated early March of 2019. No one thought much of it until he never came back to work. His name was Leon Hartridge, 43, a former truck driver who'd switched to night security after a back injury. The warehouse sat off a rural interstate, the kind of place that smells like cold concrete and diesel even after midnight. Leon's shift started at 10 and ended at 6. His wife told investigators he usually came home by 6:30, drank coffee, watched old westerns, then slept until afternoon. That pattern broke on a Wednesday night when he didn't clock out. The initial assumption was simple. Maybe he quit. Maybe he got another job, or maybe he just walked away. But the following morning, his supervisor found his lunchbox, still sealed, and a half-empty thermos on the break room counter. His reflective vest hung neatly on a hook, radio still attached. The last digital swipe of his ID was logged at 3:42 a.m., then nothing. The company filed a basic absence form, but by Friday, the sheriff's office got involved. They reviewed the overnight CCTV, 6 cameras in total. 5 worked fine. The 6th, covering the north loading dock, froze at exactly 3:41 a.m. Then, 3 minutes later, all motion detection stopped. It wasn't just a blackout. The file header showed it had been manually overwritten. Leon's brother, a retired electrician, offered to check his apartment when calls went unanswered. Inside, he found Leon's keys on the counter, wallet in the same place he always left it, and a spiral notebook on the kitchen table. The last entry, written in his blocky handwriting, read, "Clock shows 4 when I walk out. Feels later. Light's wrong color again." Investigators traced that note back to similar remarks he'd made to coworkers in the weeks before. One of them, a forklift operator named Ray Corbin, told deputies Leon had been bothered by something about the new lighting system. The company had replaced the overhead fluorescents with motion-activated LEDs that flickered under certain camera angles. He said it messed with his sense of time, Ray recalled. He'd come in thinking it was midnight and swear it was almost morning. At first, police treated the notebook as irrelevant, a tired man rambling about lights. Then came the dispatch logs. A 3:48 a.m. call had been placed from Leon's company-issued phone to a non-emergency county line. The recording still exists. He told the operator he needed to document something about the schedule. His tone was formal, detached, like he was making a statement rather than asking for help. The operator tried to clarify what he meant, but the line dropped mid-sentence. The call lasted 53 seconds. When they checked the network records, they found something else. The call didn't route through the cell tower nearest the warehouse. It bounced from a tower 30 miles east across the river. That's the same direction Leon's phone was last pinged before it went offline, near an unfinished section of the old state bypass, closed since 2011. Deputies drove out there and found fresh tire tracks in the gravel, leading toward a fenced construction lot. No vehicle was recovered. Weeks passed. Local news ran a single story: warehouse guard missing after time card dispute. Public interest faded quickly. And as fashion, local news wanted the power. But in June, the company's new HR contractor discovered something odd while auditing payroll. Leon's time card for that final night didn't just show missing hours, it showed duplicated entries. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., his ID was logged twice at two different doors, seconds apart. One swipe at the front entrance, one in the mechanical hallway. Same ID, same timestamp. Technically impossible. Investigators re-examined the internal server that housed the door logs. That's when they noticed a secondary access profile had been created using Leon's credentials, but tagged with a different department code, one belonging to the electrical maintenance division. The account was active for 1 week, then deleted. IT records listed the administrator as temporary systems testing. No one at the warehouse remembered authorizing it. The more they dug, the stranger the timeline became. Archived footage from prior nights showed brief blips in the digital clock, displays 3-second shifts where the time rolled backward before correcting itself. Leon had written about this in another note. Clock skipped again. Same moment the hum cut out. Technicians later confirmed that during those same minutes, a backup generator was cycling power for a series of sub-level fans. Only a few workers even knew the sub-levels existed. They weren't active parts of the facility anymore. When authorities finally inspected the lower level, they found old offices sealed off with plastic sheeting and warning signs for asbestos. In one corner sat an unplugged time clock terminal dated 1994. The paper spool inside it still contained partial punch cards, yellowed and brittle. One of them bore Leon's employee number, printed faintly beside the name of a former contractor who died years earlier. That discovery reframed everything. Somehow, the modern ID system had merged data with the obsolete one, producing overlapping records that made it appear Leon was in two places at once. The missing hours report he'd filed wasn't about unpaid wages, it was about time itself, slipping in a way he couldn't explain. The investigators never found conclusive proof of tampering, though one retired systems tech told local reporters that the company's old mainframe still ran partial code from a discontinued scheduling program called ShiftLine. He claimed that under rare conditions, like a power cycle during data backup, it could duplicate entries with original punch data from the archive, labeling them with active credentials. If that happened when Leon's ID was scanned, it might have triggered a fatal error, but that's still theory. What's factual is this. The same Friday, the audit uncovered the duplicate entries. A highway cleanup crew reported finding a fragment of a reflective safety vest along the bypass construction route. It matched the brand issued to Leon's team. DNA analysis was inconclusive exposure, and time had degraded it. But one detail stood out. The vest's zipper pull contained traces of oil consistent with the warehouse's loading dock equipment. In the end, the case file closed under missing person, presumed deceased. Officially, no foul play. Unofficially, everyone agreed something in that building broke his sense of time before he vanished. His wife still keeps the notebook on a shelf. The last page, just beneath his final note, has a short line written in different ink, maybe added later, maybe the same night. It reads, "Clock shows 4, door says 3. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A man noticed an inconsistency, tried to document it, and disappeared between two readings of the same minute. Whether that was error, accident, or something stranger about how those systems looped, no one can say for certain. The warehouse eventually upgraded its entire security network, scrapping every trace of the old servers. But the missing hours report still sits in the county archive, a single-page statement with the timestamp frozen at 3:42 a.m., the same moment the camera went dark. The vanishing crew of the trawler Northern Star. The story begins in Kodiak during early spring, when daylight stretched thin and the wind smelled like cold iron swept clean. Locals remembered the name Northern Star, painted in chipped blue along a tired hull that still rode steady. The boat left the harbor with 3 people and a full bunkroom of spares that stayed unused for reasons never explained. By dusk, the town watched her stern light fade toward Shelikof Strait, while fog gathered over the breakwater and swallowed the last glimmer. Mark Ellis was 46 and worked as captain after 2 decades, running small cod trips from Shignik to Hadak. He wanted a better price on pollock and believed the narrow weather window would hold long enough for a quick haul. Rosa Jimenez was 33 and listed as engineer who had shifted from cannery maintenance to sea wages through a winter of short contracts. Paul Chen was 29 and assigned as a state observer whose duty was sampling catches and submitting counts to a regional office in Anchorage. Their reason for leaving Kodiak that morning sounded simple in dispatch logs that recorded an intended 5-day loop along Shelikof. The crew planned to fish a proven corridor west of Raspberry Island, where past sets produced reliably before the season cooled. Harbor Traffic Control reportedly cleared them at 7:14 with a reminder about scattered ice near Whale Passage based on a late trawler report. A fuel receipt time-stamped 7:30 showed a last purchase and a handwriting note that read, "Check aft bilge before stretch." Witness statements came from 2 skippers who crossed their wake near the harbor outer range and described a steady heading and calm radio. One skipper believed the engine note sounded rougher than last week, though he admitted his own wheelhouse windows rattled louder than usual. Another skipper said the deck lights flickered briefly before stabilizing, which might mean a loose alternator belt or a failing breaker. Investigators never confirmed those impressions because the sound was not recorded and the breakers were later found in mid-state. In Larsen Bay, a clerk recalled Rosa buying solvent and fresh belts 2 days earlier while asking about a gasket that never arrived. Archived notes from a parts supplier listed the order as shipped to Kodiak, with no confirmation of pickup and no return entry. State records later summarized the vessel maintenance as minimal, with deferred items stapled behind the primary license renewal form. Some locals claimed the captain preferred field fixes because haul prices barely covered crew and fuel, and long yard days meant unpaid time. On the first night, a front brushed the coast and left a ragged swell that wandered south along the strait and leaned on shoals. Barometer traces from an automated station on Sitkaladak showed a gentle fall that matched the caution shared by harbor weather later. Northern Star acknowledged the broadcast and reported position near Pillar Mountain, bearing southeast, which suggested a planned crossing toward calmer lee waters. The last clear shore-based signal placed the boat midway between Whale Island and Afognak before the line thinned and scattered. A driftnet crew from Old Harbor reportedly saw a single mast light in haze just before midnight near the shoal line off Sitkanak. They judged the vessel slow by the steady bearing and believed the boat was searching for current breaks, where fish stack in pale water. Their deckhand heard a short bell strike that did not fit their equipment and could have drifted off a distant buoy. Investigators never confirmed that sound because there were no buoys charted within the range claimed in the statement. By morning, the observer office in Anchorage expected a routine check-in from Paul that usually arrived before the first set began. When no message came, the coordinator sent a reminder through the state account that drew no response and left the status pending. At noon, the company dispatcher called Kodiak Harbor to ask whether the crew had switched to a secondary channel or locked radios. Dispatch logs show the harbor initiated an information call and listed the vessel as overdue for contact, though not yet late for arrival. The first search push launched that evening with a cutter out of Kodiak and a helo assigned to a box north of Sitkaladak. Weather was passable with long swell and scattered fog that piled into valleys and released again as the wind shifted briefly. Aircrew reported a faint oil sheen near a slack eddy and marked coordinates for surface vessels to check when the tide turned. No debris was found, and currents in that corner can erase thin sheens quickly when wind and tidal streams begin running together. A week later, a crabber turned up a torn section of netting and delivered it to the station, where technicians photographed every rope splice carefully. The material matched common trawl net stock sold across the region and revealed no marks that uniquely identified the Northern Star purchase. County file from 2009 contained a similar case where net fragments misled a search until a dragged anchor was recovered near Spruce. Records conflict on whether that lesson was weighed during early decisions in the present case because notes omitted internal discussions. Rosa kept a small notebook and a waterproof pencil, according to friends, who said she recorded fuel draws and breaker resets meticulously. The book did not surface during searches, and the cabin photos released later showed drawers open with blankets stacked neatly across bunks. Some locals claimed neat bunks mean a crew expected a quick return to deck and left in order when noise rose suddenly. Investigators never confirmed that interpretation since the images were taken after several boardings, which can shift blankets and papers without intent. A grocery receipt from town listed coffee tins and packaged bread, and a second receipt listed non-perishable stew for 5 days at sea. The tally fit the planned window and matched the observer mandate, which limits extended voyages without updated station notices on catch counts. A third receipt was time-stamped late night with a handwritten circle around marine batteries that were marked discount for display stock. State records list no rule against using display stock if tested at purchase, and the vendor wrote passed on the form. Several radio captures surfaced weeks later from private sets that record local chatter and ship checks on rolling memory for hobby archives. One clip included a short call that some listeners heard as Northern Star starboard pump cycling, though others argued the tone belonged to a winch. The clip length was under 10 seconds and ended with a squelch that compressed the last word into a blur that felt unlike speech. Investigators never confirmed the source because the receiver used a homemade antenna that pulled reflections from hillsides and power lines. A shoreline team walking near Pazad Shack found a life ring without lettering, which suggested either weathering or paint worn by friction against gear. No marks tied it to the vessel, and the manufacturer sold identical rings to fleets from Seward to Unalaska during that year. The team logged coordinates and a note that wind and swell could drift objects ashore from far east or west, depending on timing. Dispatch logs show the item cataloged and stored, while other leads pulled searchers toward new reports that offered little improvement in certainty. Relatives of Mark and Rosa met with the investigator, who reviewed timelines using harbor cameras and truck stops where the crew filled supplies. The video showed ordinary movement and no passenger joining the vessel after the final dock line came off during the slow morning push. Paul carried 2 sealed cases for measurement gear and strapped them near the galley, according to a dock worker who remembered quiet efficiency. Archive notes indicate the observer training emphasized low-profile behavior, which may explain the lack of distinct sightings beyond the first hour. The engine log from a previous trip listed high hours and a note about alternator heat, which can stress breakers and dim deck lights. A yard foreman later stated that heat could trip a breaker after vibration if terminals were not torqued during the final check. Records conflict on whether that refit included terminal torque checks, since the invoice lists parts and not the torque procedure by number. Some locals claimed they heard about a warm smell during a bar conversation, and none of the speakers signed any statement afterward. There was an argument about charts because the wheelhouse held both paper and digital sets according to the inventory taken after recovery. Paper charts in that region require careful updates and pencil marks, while plotters rely on software updates and cable connections that can hang. Investigators never confirmed which system guided the boat during the last hours because the recorder held only positions updated earlier near the harbor. State records note that redundancy helps until crews rely on one system and the other drifts out of use for long stretches. The hull appeared days later when a signer found wreckage east of Sitkaladak, where swells fold on a broad shoal during tide change. The bow section carried the name under scraped paint while the stern was missing, and bulkheads showed twisting that suggested sudden stress. Divers reported no entanglement in heavy gear and saw no obvious impact point on rock faces that would leave bright scars. Investigators never confirmed a single cause, and the summary listed loss of power compounded by weather and current as a probable sequence. Personal effects amounted to a thermos lid and a chipped mug and a jacket zipper with salt packed into the teeth and seams. The items offered no names, and the thermos bore a faded sticker from a bait shop in town that had closed years earlier. Families asked for the notebook and any data tool from the observer kit, and neither appeared in recovered material from the search. State records mark those items as missing and keep the case open for supplemental entries if new shoreline finds surface after storms. A small memorial gathered near the harbor ramp at sunset, while gulls drifted over the masts and the tide rolled out slowly. A pastor read names, and the dock crew lowered a wreath into the water while the siren sounded once at full volume. Some locals claimed a light blinked offshore when the last boat horn faded, and others saw only a buoy through fog. Investigators never confirmed any offshore light and listed the observed blink as a probable buoy reflection across layered haze. Months later, a fisherman turned in a laminated card with emergency numbers that he said he found in kelp near Sitkalodek. The card matched a common set used across fleets and held no writing on the back, where some captains add quick notes. County File from 2009 mentioned similar cards washing ashore after unrelated losses because lamination helps them travel long distances. Dispatch logs record the card as non-specific while acknowledging its timing within the season and its recovery location near recurring drift lines. The official closeout summarized timelines and conditions and kept the door open for later data in case anything else drifted ashore. The report called the loss a convergence of small failures shaped by marginal weather and ordinary risk that hardened quickly into consequence. Relatives requested another pass over the shoal when fall storms cleared, and the search teams deferred pending conditions that never reached stable levels. Some locals claimed the boat remains out there buried in shifting sand, while others argued it broke apart across two reefs. What remains certain is this simple sequence documented in state records and dispatch logs and archive notes preserved in town. 3 people left Kodiak in a working boat with a plan and a route and ordinary equipment and ordinary hopes. A record of small concerns laced through their days, and none looked fatal on its own given steady watch and time. Investigators never confirmed the final minutes, and the strait kept its water quiet while the workboats carried on with morning chores. The boy missing after the Anchorage power outage. Neighbors in South Addition remember the night the streetlights failed and the block turned to quiet shapes against Cook Inlet. A rolling outage moved across Anchorage after sunset, reportedly tied to an equipment fault at a substation near Tudor. Within that dark window, a 12-year-old boy left a duplex stairwell and was not seen returning by anyone nearby. The disappearance was recorded in dispatch logs as a welfare check that escalated when the caller could not reach family members. Investigators never confirmed the exact minute he stepped off the landing, and surviving records conflict on the sequence that followed. The boy was named Connor Price, age 12, a 6th grader whose mother worked nights as a certified nursing assistant. She was 39, employed at a facility near Lake Otis, and she left home before the outage reached the neighborhood. Her brother, age 34, an auto parts clerk, reportedly checked on Connor after dinner and found him watching storm updates. The uncle told officers he planned a quick drive toward Midtown for batteries, then doubled back when the traffic signals died. State records list his return time as approximate, and some locals claimed they saw the car pass once without stopping. The second person in the case file is Michael Reese, age 47, a floor technician assigned to overnight cleaning at a public office. He rented a ground floor unit in the same building, and he told officers he met the boy a handful of times. Reese said he heard a door close during the outage and looked through a peephole toward the landing. The hallway was dark, the emergency light flickering, and a shoe squeaked once on painted concrete. Archive notes say Reese could not identify whose steps he heard, and investigators never confirmed whether the sound preceded any exterior movement. The third person is Officer Lena Garvey, age 31, the first uniformed responder to sign the initial incident number that evening. She arrived after the lights returned for 2 minutes, then went down again as if the circuit tripped under load. Garvey walked the alley with a flashlight and found a bicycle leaned beside a trash enclosure behind the laundry room. The bicycle reportedly belonged to Connor, though the county file from 2009 notes the registration sticker was unreadable under winter grime. Records conflict over whether the seat height matched his last measurement, and investigators never confirmed if another child borrowed the bike earlier. Dispatch logs show multiple calls about power fluctuations and elevator alarms during the same half hour across adjacent blocks. A maintenance crew radioed a transformer smell near the corner convenience store, then lost contact when their handhelds failed inside a cinder block stairwell. An outage map captured by a local blogger shows a blotch along 8th Avenue, shaded deeper where circuits overlapped across feeders. The image circulated widely that week, and some locals claimed it proved a deliberate shutdown rather than a fault. Investigators never confirmed the blogger's data source, and state records cautioned that crowd screenshots often distort the real switching boundaries. According to the mother's statement, Connor stayed home with a list on the fridge and reminders about homework and the hallway light. She took the bus toward Lake Otis before sunset and called once from the break room during the first reported flicker. The call dropped after a greeting, and she told detectives the silence felt routine during a storm watch. She tried again on her next break and reached voicemail, then contacted her brother, who said he would drive back immediately. Dispatch logs note her third call at shift change, when she reported her nephew missing and asked for a unit to check the duplex. When Garvey stepped inside, the apartment air was cool and smelled like wet socks and an open box of detergent. A pot of macaroni sat crusted on the stove, and a pencil lay under worksheets spread across the table. The window looked toward a utility pole where a crossarm leaned, reportedly cracked by wind during a squall that crossed the water earlier. Garvey noted a jacket missing from hooks by the door and found boots damp with slush left in the corner. The county file from 2009 emphasizes that damp boots were common that month, and investigators never confirmed whether Connor owned another pair. Anchorage police coordinated with utility crews who were moving along feeders to test for faults after repeated trips under load. A crew chief told officers the substation protection had isolated a bad run and that service would stabilize after switching. The crew chief also mentioned a brief arc recorded on supervisory screens around the time neighbors reported the boy leaving. Archived notes capture his phrasing carefully, and state records remind readers that arcs happen often during winter switching. Some locals claimed the arc aligned with the alley and suggested an electrical scare might have drawn the boy outside, though investigators never confirmed that scenario. A security camera at the convenience store faced the corner, then turned off when the outage rolled across that grid square. The owner found corrupted files on the recorder, reportedly caused by repeated starts that exceeded the small battery's tolerance. 2 frames remained legible, showing a figure with a hood stepping past stacked bags of ice and pausing at the curb. The height and jacket length were consistent with a small teenager, though shadows widened the outline against the snow. Records conflict on whether the hood carried a stitched logo, and investigators never confirmed a clear facial image from those frames. Searchers walked the Chester Creek Trail the next morning, moving slowly where tire ruts froze into ridges beside the path. A volunteer found a glove near a bench, blue knit with stretched wrist seams and a smudge of grit on 2 fingers. The mother said Connor owned gloves like that, then grew uncertain when shown a photo that made the knit look darker. The item entered evidence with a notation about uncertain ownership and environmental contamination from overnight frost. Dispatch logs record a second glove reported near the lagoon, then withdrawn when the caller failed to answer a callback, and investigators never confirmed its existence. Is less than hash own. 0 hash is greater than. Reese told detectives he took out trash during the outage and watched headlights scatter on wet pavement along the alley mouth. He believed he saw 2 silhouettes at the corner, one short and one taller, moving quickly toward a bus stop without speaking. The taller figure held a bag that knocked against a thigh, and the smaller shape glanced back once, then ducked behind a plow berm. Reese admitted uncertainty about distance because a neighbor's generator vibrated metal stairs, blurring his focus during the observation. Archive notes repeat that admission twice, and state records mark the sighting as uncorroborated, though the timing matched the outage window closely. The uncle described his errand as routine, a circuit of 2 stores that usually carried batteries and a small propane canister. He said traffic stalled along C Street because signals blinked, then went dark, and drivers edged through with horn taps. He circled once near the duplex, saw the stairwell light flash, and assumed the unit would stabilize after the next switch. When he reached the door, he called the boy's name and found quiet rooms and a page of homework under a phone. Records conflict over whether he entered the building on his first pass, and investigators never confirmed his drive path using available cameras. During interviews, classmates mentioned a plan for sledding after the next snowfall, with a meeting point near a small park in Midtown. One friend reportedly texted about a borrowed sled and a repaired headlamp that could run on backup batteries. The phone recovered from the table contained an unfinished reply that referenced the headlamp but not the meeting point specifically. The county file from 2009 highlights the gap between the unfinished reply and the last status report recorded by the device. Investigators never confirmed whether the boy intended to leave for that plan during the outage, though some locals claimed they heard excited voices outdoors. Weather logs show gusts along the inlet that lifted salty spray and glazed sidewalks through brief freezing drizzle. Utility crews reported linemen slipping on ladders and pausing work to salt rails at a substation gate. A transit driver radioed about passengers crowding on board while streetlights remained dark, then asked dispatch for guidance about unsupervised minors. That message appears in dispatch logs 3 minutes after the first welfare check, placing both threads inside the same operational window. Investigators never confirmed whether the driver passed the boy's block, and state records refrained from connecting those events beyond proximity and shared conditions. A resident 2 buildings east kept a paper notebook for power blanks because appliances sometimes failed during voltage dips. He wrote times in blocky numbers and kept tallies for each blink counted in the kitchen with a candle burning nearby. His notes include a scribble labeled child voice, then a short arrow toward the alley where the bicycle was recovered earlier. Archived notes indicate the resident could not recall whether the voice came before or after the second deep blackout. The county file from 2009 cautions that manual notations during outages are notoriously fuzzy, and investigators never confirmed the accuracy of the marks. By the second day, snow hardened into ruts and footprints lost shape under municipal plow passes along the trail network. A drone team flew grids above the greenbelt, then battled interference near transmission lines that hummed as power stabilized across feeders. The team reported brief signal jitter along one corridor that paralleled the alley and turned toward a drainage culvert under the avenue. Some locals claimed the jitter implied an object inside the culvert, though the pilot later tested and reproduced interference near similar lines. Investigators never confirmed any anomaly beyond routine radio noise, and state records treat the flight logs as inconclusive but properly archived. Several tips arrived from neighborhoods west of Minnesota Drive, where residents reported a boy matching Connor's height near a bus kiosk. One caller described a child in a gray jacket asking about a route to turn again, then walking away when a bus arrived. Another caller insisted the boy rode north toward a stop near Northern Lights, carrying a bag shaped like a folded sled. The uncle told officers Connor did not own a folding sled, then paused and said a friend might have loaned one earlier. Records conflict on whether that friend was contacted promptly, and investigators never confirmed the kiosk sightings beyond uncollected footprints on packed snow. On the third day, the mother returned to the duplex with an officer and found a faint shoe mark on the stairwell landing. The print was partial, smudged by slush, and measured close to the size the boy wore during the previous winter. A second print overlapped at an angle that suggested a quick turn toward the alley door rather than the interior hallway. Photographs entered the county file from 2009 show grainy edges and flash reflections from chipped paint across the riser. Some locals claim the prints proved a rushed exit, though investigators never confirmed gate direction from marks that degraded under repeated entries. A week later, state records show the case coded for continuing investigation with periodic checks when new outage reports surface. Utilities repaired the cracked crossarm and replaced fuses that had tripped during the storm, then published a maintenance summary on their website. The summary listed the outage window within broader operations and mentioned no injuries recorded during the night of the disappearance. Families in the neighborhood saved copies of the page, and archived notes record residents arguing over the meaning of terse language. Investigators never confirmed any link between the maintenance summary and the case, and dispatch logs closed the thread without additional explanation. The mother kept working nights, reportedly moving to a different facility after winter gave way to an early break in ice. She told a counselor she avoided the alley and took a longer path around the block when errands required walking past the stairwell. Reese transferred to a different building, and the uncle changed shifts at the parts store, then stopped answering reporters who knocked. Some locals claimed these changes were meaningful, while neighbors said people adjust their routes when winter ends and work schedules shift. The county file from 2009 preserves both views without judgment, and investigators never confirmed that any adjustment held investigative weight. Years later, the duplex paint flaked in the same stairwell, and the door closer still dragged when the hallway cooled. A new tenant found a child's library card under the second step, then turned it over to a clerk downtown. The clerk checked the number and found the card expired before the outage, then wrote a note that attached to the record. Archived notes say the mother could not identify the card as her son's, and records conflict on the listed address. Investigators never confirmed a connection, though the discovery reopened conversations that move through Anchorage whenever lights flicker against winter clouds. The stories. Why this motel room safe changed everything. They called it a budget motel along a long highway spur, where road dust gathered in corners and secrets settled quietly. The room safe in number 12 looked ordinary enough, powder-coated steel with a keypad that beeped politely at tired travelers. Lyle Garza woke before sunrise on a Tuesday, 38 years old, and working claims for a regional insurer. He had driven 3 hours to meet a policyholder whose pickup had burned behind the old diner, and he wanted clean paperwork today. He checked into the motel first, showered fast, then laid out forms on the dresser, careful about matching VIN digits and timestamps. His plan was simple: wrap the inspection before lunch, then circle back for photos and voice notes after the truck release. He liked driving while the day still felt open, and he told himself the assignment would be routine and forgettable. It had been forgettable until the manager knocked. 2 quick raps, then a pause heavy enough to make him frown. Mara Quintero stood in the doorway with a clipboard, 34, managing rooms and payroll while raising her nephew after school. She asked if he had heard the beeps from the safe, because front desk saw brief power spikes last night. Lyle said he had not used the safe, and she nodded, eyes moving toward the keypad like someone checking a stove twice. Maintenance had logged an odd complaint the previous afternoon. Reportedly, a guest in 12 claimed the safe ate his wallet. The man left before checkout, promising to call the card companies, and a note in the margin said possible intoxication. Mara said housekeeping later pulled the bedding and found a small metal tool near the baseboard. Lyle picked up the tool carefully with a tissue, a thin square of steel with a notch like a feeler gauge. He set it on the desk with his forms, then opened his voice recorder, speaking in that steady tone he used for field notes. He described the room, the safe brand, the tool, and the time on the microwave clock because simple details held steady on lonely days. Mara asked if he knew how to clear the safe code since the master sheet had gone missing during renovations last winter. He did not, but he knew the trick of powering off consumer locks, which could flip hidden defaults, according to a warehouse supervisor he once interviewed. He unplugged the mini fridge, found the breaker panel behind a painting, then asked permission to shut the room briefly. They stood in the doorway while the lights flickered, and the highway hummed like a restless air conditioner beyond the lot. He waited 10 seconds, restored power, then tapped the keypad with a ballpoint, feeling silly and a little curious. The safe beeped twice in a lower tone, which he recognized from a training video about apartment lockouts. reportedly used by traveling warranty teams. He tried a factory code that someone had once mumbled during a fire inspection, and the safe chirped, green light winking. The door opened an inch against a sticky seal, and Mara let out a nervous laugh, surprised and worried in equal measure. Inside sat a clear zipper pouch with a folded receipt, a motel keycard from another town, and a small black voice recorder. He found a driver loyalty card attached to the receipt, and he read the printed name softly without repeating it twice. The dates lined up with last week in neat columns, and the purchase list looked like roadside dinners between midnight and 2. He asked Mara if the guest from yesterday had paid cash, and she nodded, then reached for the phone to check archived calls. The front desk handset kept scratchy tapes by default, a habit from the previous owner who never trusted software invoices. She played a call stamped at 2 in the morning, where a tired voice asked for room 12, mentioning a late delivery, and stiff back. Another call at 2:30 asked about vending, and a third at 4 asked if nobody would bother him until noon. Lyle switched to evidence mode, careful and methodical, letting his coffee cool while he cataloged the pouch contents. He photographed the safe before moving anything, then called his supervisor to report an unexpected discovery unrelated to the truck claim. The supervisor told him to act reasonably and preserve anything with identifiable information, then to keep his focus on the scheduled inspection. He listened to the voice recorder after asking Mara to stay within earshot, since 2 listeners felt wiser than one on strange mornings. The first file held roadway noise, then a quiet tone of someone rehearsing directions, same room number repeated like a sticky thought. The second file was shorter, a man saying he could not keep doing this and that she would understand once it was delivered safely. He paused to note the words safely, which felt pointed given the open door and the blinking keypad. He bagged the recorder in a zip bag from his kit, then checked the keycard from the other town, which was stamped with a lion logo. Mara recognized the chain and said there was a property 30 miles north, mostly used by truckers and medical travelers. He returned the room to normal and headed for the burned truck with his camera bag, but his plan had started to wobble. The pickup sat behind a towing yard fence, soot clinging thick to the firewall, while melted wires drooped like tired ivy. He worked the usual grid of photos, then the odometer and the cargo bed, then cross-reference with dispatch notes he had requested by email. The fire report smelled like common engine loss, not sabotage, and he felt relief settle along his shoulders as the cause narrowed. He dictated measurements and closed the laptop, then looked at his watch and thought about the safe again and the trembling voice. He felt a nudge of duty that had nothing to do with premiums, and he drove back to the motel through heat that made the road shimmer. Mara met him with a printout of last night guests, which listed an alias that matched the loyalty card name partly. The address field showed a mail drop location, familiar to freight drivers who rolled through without a fixed base. She said a long white tractor had idled near the ice machine last night, according to a neighbor who called about fumes after midnight. He asked for the neighbor number, then listened to a careful woman describe a man in a reflective jacket with a limp. She said he stayed near room 12 door, not inside, as if waiting for someone to arrive quietly or leave quickly. She heard 2 quiet knocks around 3, and a soft voice answered, then a cart rattle like someone moving luggage without wheels. Lyle opened the pouch again and noticed a handwritten code on the receipt back, 4 digits and a messy star next to it. He tried the code on the safe, and the delay light flashed, which often meant an old user lockout or a wrong sequence. He snapped a photo and lowered the door, then rolled the notched tool between his fingers, a weight that felt borrowed from someone patient. He thought about a repairman he had interviewed in 2019, who taught him that thieves love patterns more than courage. The man said patterns live in receipts, tolls, and vending logs, because tired people seek familiar sandwiches and coffee brands. Lyle searched the loyalty program website on his phone, typed the partial name and 4 digits, and got a generic profile with travel points. The profile showed recent redemptions listed by city, and he wrote them on a notepad, then drew lines between dates and approximate routes. The cities formed a loop around distribution centers, with brief pauses near hospitals and bulk pharmacy hubs according to public maps. He felt his heart step faster as the voice recorder line about delivered safely nudged his thoughts toward the quiet side of medicine. He told Mara he would drive north to the Lion Logo Motel for a quick visit, and she insisted on calling ahead politely. The clerk up there skimmed her stay sheets and mentioned a forgotten envelope last week found under a mattress frame during turnover. The envelope held nothing when housekeeping retrieved it, but a corner showed marks from a rubber band, reportedly stretched tight. He reached the northern property by mid-afternoon, watched trucks rock gently in wind, and asked for the manager on duty. A tall man with tired eyes met him in the lobby, said a nurse had asked about a lost pouch 3 nights ago. She wore a badge from a staffing agency, spoke quickly, and left a number that went to voicemail full by morning. The manager allowed a quick look at the lost and found cabinet, which contained phone chargers, a chipped mug, 3 lanyards, and a plastic bag with an empty pharmacy sticker peeled halfway. Lyle photographed the bag and wrote the former label number carefully, then stepped into the parking lot to call a friend in compliance he trusted. The friend checked a public database of recalls and shortages, then told him to consider the rise in small clinical thefts along transport corridors. He returned to his car and replayed the second audio file, hearing the way the man swallowed hard between sentences. The phrase "delivered safely" stuck again, and he wondered if safely meant to someone specific, not to a warehouse or anonymous shelf. He drove back to the first motel with a plan forming, not quite a theory, but a set of steps that could either untangle or embarrass him. He asked Mara for permission to review last week's camera footage that covered the breezeway near room 12, and she agreed. The feed was old, grainy, and stamped with the wrong date, since nobody reset it after storms in 2015. Still, silhouettes moved clearly enough. And at 3:12, a figure in a reflective jacket appeared with a short, careful stride. The figure waited near the door, then crouched to slide something under, then stood fast as another figure approached from the stairwell. The second person carried a rolling cart with a blanket thrown over, which hung low enough to hide a small, cooler shape. They exchanged a short handshake, then rolled the cart toward the soda machine area, where cameras always blinked with static. Lyle paused the frame and sketched the handshake position, because small, consistent gestures tied people to habits when faces stayed hidden. He compared the notebook times to the archived calls, matching the neighbor report with the footage minute stamp nearly exactly. He folded his notes and looked at Mara, who watched quietly with the clipboard held like a shield against a sudden chill. He called the non-emergency line and asked to speak with property crimes, then explained he was an adjuster who found items in a room safe. He said the items might connect to an ongoing pattern, not a single incident, and that he was available to hand them over cleanly. The dispatcher thanked him and routed the call, and he kept his voice steady while explaining that nobody was hurt today. The detective who arrived wore a tie gone soft at the edges, a man who had seen this exact motel a dozen times. He took the pouch, the recorder, and copies of the photos, then asked Lyle to explain the breaker trick and the code attempts. He nodded at the handshake frame and said a group had moved product along back roads for months, staying under dollar thresholds on purpose. Lyle asked quietly if product meant medicine, and the detective said people cut solutions with water and resold to small clinics. In some stories, the clinics were victims with forged orders, and in others, they were partners, trying to stretch short supplies like taffy. The man in the reflector jacket likely ran deliveries for cash while hauling legal freight, which made tracing routes messy and confusing. The detective listened to the voice files twice, then looked at the loyalty redemptions and circled 2 cities with his pen. He said the phrase "delivered safely" could mean to a person at a care home who could not pay official prices anymore. The pouch might have served as a drop signal, and the room safe might have held a stopgap in case someone panicked. They took statements from Mara and the neighbor by phone, and the manager at the northern property sent a scanned copy of his notes. The detective collected the notch tool and said it was standard for bypassing cam locks, which matched a series of quiet thefts from vending. He asked Lyle to write a formal summary of his steps, meticulous and dated, and to expect a follow-up if a warrant landed later. Lyle finished the paper part in his room, breathing slow while light crept through the blinds in a warm, tired stripe. He wrote down the way the safe beeped twice after power restoration, which suggested a default that any one patient could eventually find. He wrote the route loop and the hospital adjacency, and he wrote the voice phrasing exactly because transcription mattered when memories warped. He closed his laptop and stared at the open safe like it wanted to be ordinary again, silent and blank and light. He felt that shift people talk about when routine work bends into something it has no business touching on a weekday. He thought about honest clinics, rationing doses, then about someone paying cash at 3 in the morning because a parent cried. At dusk, the detective called back and said a unit found the white tractor idling near a different budget property downtown. The driver had the same chain lanyard from the lost and found cabinet, and his phone contained notes about room safes by brand. He reportedly told officers he was only a messenger and that someone else handled actual swapping and dilution, which sounded flat and practiced. Lyle listened quietly and said he would be available if a deposition request arrived. Then he sat with the keycard on the dresser. He knew he would remember the feel of that notched tool because it had a purpose-built patience that felt personal. He knew he would remember the cheap beep of the safe and the way a single small space changed the line of his day. A week later, he got an email from the detective, brief and measured, thanking him for the timeline and the careful photos. The message said the pouch had traces of saline and a label adhesive compound common to medical packaging of a certain class. The voice on the recorder matched a man pulled over near a way station, according to dispatch logs and an archived booking photo. Lyle drove back to the motel after closing another case, and he asked Mara how business felt since the long Tuesday. She said people still stopped for highway rest, and she tightened a few procedures quietly, preferring to let small changes speak. She now kept master codes in a locked drawer and replaced 3 aging safes with models that logged attempts for a full week. They stood in room 12 a moment, like visitors paying respects to an inanimate witness that never blinked. The safe sat closed and calm, doing exactly what a box was meant to do, which felt both reassuring and strange. He signed the receipt for his stay, then shook her hand, and promised to bring better stories next time through. On the drive home, he thought about the phrase delivered safely again and how words can hide more than they reveal. He wondered how many small transactions keep the world running, good and bad, unremarkable and decisive, stacked behind quiet doors. He decided the safe had not made him heroic or special, it had only reminded him that dull edges can cut when pressure builds. He kept working claims, taking pictures of bent bumpers and damp carpet, writing notes with careful times and plain language. He still believed that truth likes details and that details prefer patient notebooks, not flashy speeches or clever hunches. When he thought about that Tuesday, he did not think about danger or chase lights. He thought about how a box opened and a day veered left. Mara hired another housekeeper and bought a better cart, one that glided without rattling near cameras and soda machines. She laughed more at the front desk now, but her eyes still checked keys and codes before she turned off the lights. She told her nephew that small routines matter, like counting towels and returning clipboards, because order resists the creep of careless luck. The detective moved on to other cases and sent one last note months later, carefully worded, acknowledging ongoing court schedules. He wrote that the room safe discovery had clarified timing between suspects, which helped align witness statements with fuel receipts precisely. He added a line about public hearings scheduled for late next spring, where facts would hopefully land on paper clearly. The motel kept renting room 12 to travelers who wanted ground-level convenience and an easy walk to the ice. The safe held wallets and passports and nothing dramatic for a while, which suited everyone whose name stayed off any report. The highway kept pouring itself past the parking lot, and the night clerk kept coffee hot for anyone who needed comfort. Lyle sometimes thought about stopping by without a claim, just to buy a soda and wave at the office through dusty glass. He pictured the safe blinking quietly in that square of afternoon sun, as if practicing for whatever day came next. He accepted that the box had not changed him completely, but it had polished a habit he already valued deeply. He looked back on it like a narrow bridge he crossed safely, not a legend, just a real span over a quiet creek. He had listened, he had written, he had looked twice, and he had taken small steps that lined up neatly. That felt like enough for a life that preferred steady roads to loud headlines, and it still does.